Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Insight with Beyond the Headlines and Political Tours. Nelson Mandela is credited with bringing about a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy. Almost 30 years later, the ANC, the party that he led, remains in power, and South Africa today is one of the most unequal nations in the world, with over half the country living in poverty. Over the next hour, we're going to take a look at Nelson Mandela, the challenges South Africa faced at the end of apartheid, and then we look at his legacy. Joining me here to discuss this, we have Ambassador Nozipho January-Bardill, former Deputy Director General of South Africa's Department of Foreign Affairs. Hello, Nozipho. Can you tell us where you are at the moment, and also just say a few words about yourself? I've mentioned just a very short bit of what you've done. You've had an extensive career.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. Yes, my name is Nozipho January-Bardill, and I live in Johannesburg, and where I've been for quite a number of years now. I haven't always lived in Joburg, but it's my new home. I also serve on some company boards, so I'm also very aware of what's happening in the corporate sector. And I chair the Council of the Nelson Mandela University, which is also a very interesting place as we try to reinvent it into really upholding Madiba's values.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much for joining us. We've also got Peter Sullivan, who is the former managing editor of the Independent Newspaper Group and editor of the Star newspaper during the period when Nelson Mandela was released from prison and eventually became president. Peter has also been the leader on our political tours in South Africa. Hello, Peter, where are you?
I'm also in Johannesburg, and yeah, beautiful, lovely, sunny day, delightful. Seems like supposed to be winter, but it's probably more like your summer.
Fantastic. And I see you've got a COVID-19 haircut as well.
Just a little bit. Right.
My hair's probably longer, just as long anyway. Well, both Nozipho and Peter have their own first-hand experiences of meeting and working with Mandela, and it's a great opportunity to hear more about him. So we're going to do this in two parts. To start with, we're going to get a more personal perspective, and then we'll look at his legacy and the problems South Africa faces today, but also the problems that South Africa faced at the time when he came to power. We'll ask what has been achieved and what could or should have been done differently. If you've got any questions, you know the routine, please put them in the Q&A box just below here, and then we'll come to you and open your microphone later in the program. At the end of the hour, do stay online for our own discussion. This is your opportunity to share your views and observations about the discussion. So if I may, I'm going to start with Peter. Peter, you were editor of the Star paper, which was South Africa's leading paper at a critical time. So you had lots of opportunities to follow that transition period, but also come into first-hand contact with Madiba. So can you just talk a bit about when you first met him, and then a bit about how that relationship changed over the years?
Right, Nicholas. The really anecdotes, I suppose, is, the first time I met him was when he came out of prison. And then 6 months later, I met him again, which I think was at the British High Commissioner had a tea. And there was a long line of people, and I was in the line. And when I got to him, I said, "Peter Sullivan from the Star." And he said, "Yes, I'm Nelson Mandela. You met me in Cape Town. You've obviously forgotten my name," he said, which is kind of typical of him, you know. And then I think the other story I wanted to say was when I went with him with my children. He phoned and said, "Come to breakfast." So I went to breakfast, and and I said to my children, "Please stay outside," because they were very small, and if you come inside, you're going to break something, you know. And he said, no, come inside. And I said, no, I'm your father, and I'm telling you to stay outside. And he said, "Well, I'm your president, and I'm telling you to come inside." And I said, "Look, I'm sorry, but your father is more important." And he said, "Well, I'm also your father's president, so you will come inside," which they duly did, and they sort of wandered around his house. And my youngest daughter, Julia, eventually leant over, because Mandela often had a very cross expression. He looked like he was angry, you know, even though he wasn't. It was a natural kind of frown. And she leant over and kissed him on the top of his head. And he turned around and said, "What was that for?" And she said, "You looked cross and I thought you needed a kiss." And then for, I would say, the next 6 years, every time Mandela would see me in a crowd or whatever, he'd say, "Where's Julia? Call her. I need a kiss because I'm cross." He really was he was a lovely man. I mean, these pictures of him coming to the Star. So he and I got on very well. We did have one huge fight right at the beginning. I have found in politics that the politicians that I've got on best with are the ones that I've had one huge fight with right at the beginning. And he and I had that fight, which was good. This is, he complained that he hadn't been in the paper enough. And I said to him, "You're on page 1, 2, 3. I mean, you're even on the sports pages. How much more do you want?" He said, "I should be on every page." And at the end of the year, I presented him with this front page montage. He had been our front page lead picture rather, not lead story, for 23 times in the year. And I said that was an all-time record for any human being. And so we had this whole montage made and handed to him.
I think the next photo actually might be when you went for breakfast. Is that it then?
That's exactly it, yeah. And he asked my eldest daughter, Helen, what she wanted to be. And she said she wanted to be a vet. And he said, "I have some cattle in Puno. Will you come to look after them?" And she said, looked at him and she said, "I don't think so." To my embarrassment, right? And then I said she's named after Helen Suzman, because Helen Suzman had retired from Parliament in the same year she was born. And my youngest daughter, he said, "And what are you going to be?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "But my darling, you always tell me exactly what you want to be." And she said, "He asked me what I'm going to be, Dad. How do I know what that is? I know what I want to be, but I don't know what I'm going to be." And then a couple of years later, Helen Suzman phoned about something. And Julia picked up the phone, went and put it down. She said to me, "Is she still boxing, Dad?" I said, "Boxing?" She said, "Yes, when we met Mr. Mandela, he said, 'Oh, she was a great fighter, Helen Suzman.'" And I just wondered if she was still boxing. Anyway, those are my stories of my children.
Very good. Well, we're gonna Nozipho, you've got your you worked with them for quite some time, because you worked in the foreign ministries, you came across them there, but also on board meetings, because you involved in a number of South African companies. So you've got your own encounters. Can you tell us just a snippet or two of those?
Yes. Well, you know, he was released when I was still in England. I lived in England for 10 years before I came back home in 1993. And remember, he was released in 1990. And so when I came back, I worked for an organization called World University Service, and we were sort of funding people who had been in exile and who were at Robben Island, and they were all being released. And the purpose of the organization was to find them jobs and give them some money so that they could get on with their lives at least for 2 years, and that's the minimum we could do. So I met him once or twice in those periods when we were really discussing how World University was going to support the ex-political prisoners who were being released. And then I moved to Parliament. I went to Parliament as head of transformation and democratization, and he was the president then. So I used to see him every day in Parliament.
I mean, we've heard from Peter what his sense of humor was like, but what was he actually like when it came to, you know, getting stuff done and interacting with you? I mean, what was he like as a person?
Well, I mean, he was always smiling. You know, I didn't experience that frown that Peter's talking about, certainly when I was in Parliament, because he knew all of us, and he used to banter and ask us how things were getting on and so on. But not very close proximity I had with him for the years that I was in Parliament. But when I did leave Parliament and became a consultant, I was asked by the Nelson Mandela Foundation to come and do some training for his board. And of course, then it was all about raising money to give the money to poor communities, especially those that didn't have schools. You know, he was very much into stopping CEOs in their corridors and asking them for cash. And he wanted it now. So the board's responsibility was to make sure that the money was used appropriately and as we promised the funders. But Madiba didn't want to hear anything of that. You know, for him, once the money was in the bank, it had to be spent immediately. And he wasn't concerned with good governance or anything like that. Not in a bad way, because, you know, he just wanted things to get on. So he says, oh, stop all of this nonsense and telling me about boards and how we need to look after the cash. I mean, you know that we were going to use the cash responsibly. And the thing is, we need our schools built, and we cannot have you bureaucrats sit around and talk about, you know, how the money is going to be spent.
I think
that's
that's
how he was, you know.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I want to come back to that a little bit later about that sort of questioning about whether you need to get the money spent, but sometimes you've got to put time into good bureaucracy. Good bureaucracy is very important. But let's come back to that in a moment. Peter, he was a great unifier, and we need to go back again to talk about some of the problems that South Africa faced and also critical decisions. He brought the country together at a time of enormous uncertainty. Can you talk a bit about that? And also there was political violence and also a question about which way the economy should be taken, because after all, the ANC came from a good communist background. It was a revolutionary organization. So the South Africa we see today certainly wasn't inevitable.
Sure. So in 1993, for instance, I mean, in KwaZulu-Natal, there were about 30 deaths a day with the IFP fighting against the ANC. We, in fact, had the two leaders come to lunch at the Star. One was Zuma, who became president, and the other one was the leader of the IFP. And trying to stop that violence was really difficult because you weren't quite sure who was, well, they felt in KwaZulu-Natal, they weren't quite sure who was going to become the government of the country. And Buthelezi in Natal wanted KwaZulu-Natal almost to become a separate country. And this violence just went on, and the entire world's press seemed to think South Africa was going to go up in flames or there was going to be a civil war. And quite frankly, we probably did come quite close to it. I have to say that the Star, my newspaper, all the way through said that we're going to get through it all, and people accused us of sunshine journalism because the rest of the newspapers in the country said, oh, a civil war is inevitable. But Mandela really stepped up into the reconciliation role. I think he was naturally a reconciliator. But once he got into his stride and he started inviting or going to see Betsy Verwoerd and going to see the guy who prosecuted him and put him into jail, he started to enjoy the whole reconciliation thing. And of course, the whole world watched with great amazement as he embraced all his former jailers, as he had no bitterness towards the National Party, as he and FW in the beginning got on very well, FW de Klerk and PW. No, I think without Mandela, we may well have had who knows, but we may well have gone over that precipice and had a civil war or come closer to it than we did.
This photograph here is actually taken from a later period, and this is actually to do with people attacking immigrants in South Africa, and we'll come on to that as well in a moment. But I think it's very interesting, the idea of him as a unifier and of averting that kind of conflict. But the other questions at the time were about the economy and which direction the economy should be taken in, and there was certainly a debate within the ANC about that. This is, we've got mining is obviously an enormously important sector to South Africa, a principal part of its economy. This is actually a photograph taken on one of our tours, as you may remember, Peter, when we actually went, this is a platinum mine, and we went right down and we could see the miners actually drilling away at the surface. But can you just talk about the couple, that's our group too, us looking gorgeous in our yellow, where's Peter? I can't see Peter in there. I think he must be taking the photograph.
The yellow barrel.
At the back there. Isn't he standing at the back?
Yeah, no, I'm not too sure that is him actually. I think that's one of the people showing us around. And there's Jim Lernstein down at the bottom right, who's aged about 89 now, which is incredible. Anyway, But Peter, what were there were some big decisions that were being made there, and it wasn't inevitable that South Africa would become a market economy.
No, I mean, you know, at Davos, he very famously said at Davos, he said that he sat he sat with all the great leaders of industry of the world, not just of South Africa or Africa. And he explained to them why it was important to nationalize the mines and nationalize the banks. And he was very emphatic about it, and he knew exactly what he was talking about because he'd spent a long time in jail thinking about it. He said, and they were very quiet. And then he said they slowly spoke in words of single syllables. He said, when I woke up in the morning, I realized what they had been telling me was that I did not understand the new world. And that's when we decided not to nationalize the banks and not to nationalize. Anyway, on another one of our political tours, I took a group to see Mbeki, President Mbeki, and they said, why did you move away from nationalization? And I said, oh, Mandela told me at Davos, you know why. And Mbeki said, no, it's a completely different story. In fact, he and Oliver Tambo had gone to see Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro it's quite a long story, had explained to them why nationalization was certainly not going to work in the first 10 years because they needed to create. He asked them, do you have engineers in the ANC? Do you have bankers in the ANC? And they'd said, no. And he'd said, well, I think that you should get those people first before you think of nationalization. Now, whether or not that decision was taken sort of by the people in exile or by the people back here, the ANC finally decided not to go with nationalization of the banks and the mines. That's still a bone of contention. And to some extent, that's where the EFF comes in at the moment, is that they believe that the revolution wasn't completed and that they need to nationalize everything, including all the land.
Let's go to the next slide, Isabel. Let's go to the next slide, if you can. Yeah, so I think the key thing that we've got a series of slides here that really just show typical South African life in the townships. Is the level of poverty, the improvements that people expected have not come. I mean, maybe Nozipho, you might disagree with this, but let's just run through some of these slides. The World Bank released a study in 2015. There more statistics have come out since. 52% of the country living in poverty. And these are pretty stark figures. So there is a question hanging over the ANC, which has been in power all this time, about governance and their ability to deliver. I think in a second we've got another slide coming up that shows there's been an uptick in poverty very recently as well. So particularly since under the Zuma years as well. Yeah. Here's that group. Nozipho, do you see that assessment? Nozipho, do you think that's a fair assessment? I mean, the statistics speak for themselves, but that's something you agree with.
Well, yes, I think that South Africa is known to have the biggest discrepancies in wealth and poverty in the world. I mean, we often compare it with India. And you know, the thing is about our situation is that it's very visible. It's not just a sense. It's visible if you live in Johannesburg and you live in a suburb like I live in Morningside, in Sandton, which is probably the wealthiest part of South Africa, and juxtaposed next door is Alexander Township, which is probably one of the poorest, most downtrodden kind of informal settlement, crammed with people. And as we are able to shut down from COVID, they can't, because there's 6 of them, you know, staying in a one-bedroomed corrugated iron shack, and people have to get out. They can't stay in. So there's no doubt about the discrepancies and the fact that it's a very wealthy country, but there are lots of poverty. And to a large extent, you know, the government has to take the bulk of responsibility for the situation that we find ourselves in. I think we were doing pretty well, Peter, during the Mbeki years after we didn't privatize and we didn't nationalize the mines and the banks. And the ANC had thought that we would have an economic program which was called the Reconstruction and Development Program. And if I recall, the Reconstruction and Development Program was really a social program that was going to resource education and health and all the basic needs that the people of South Africa needed after coming out of apartheid. And the reason why we left and they left the Reconstruction and Development Social Program is that they had to pay a lot of the debt that had been incurred by the previous apartheid government because of all the wars that they were fighting in the region. And so they shifted to a more sort of economic project, which was GEAR. What was it called? GEAR. What's GEAR, Peter? Remember? Remind me. What's the acronym stand for? I can't remember. Anyway, the GEAR program was moved away from a social program, partly because the World Bank and the IMF had also suggested that it would cost too much to go for a social program, and we wouldn't be able to sustain it. And so began, I think, an age where we saw the fiscus really being eroded and companies not investing in South Africa to the extent that our economy didn't grow. I think during the Mbeki years, I think Mbeki being an economist, he actually did make quite a difference between before 2008, so that when people characterized Madiba and Mbeki, Madiba was seen as being the peacemaker. He's the guy who brought peace to South Africa and chose peace, whereas Mbeki is really characterized as the president who grew the economy, who was able to reduce the number of unemployed people in the country and who gave the private sector some confidence that South Africa's growth would actually...
Let's go to the next slide, and then they'll give Peter possibly an opportunity to respond to that. I mean, I guess there's an argument between the legacy of apartheid and then the competence or incompetence of government. The ANC has been in power throughout this time. It has a complete monopoly on power. So, it is, surely responsible for the failure to address these very fundamental problems. Peter, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think I agree with Nozipho. Under Mbeki, who was a good economist, Mbeki really ran the country from the day that Mandela became president. Mandela had very little to do with running the country. Mbeki was the prime minister effectively, although he didn't have the title. And he ran the economy, and he ran the economy for 10 years, and he ran it very well indeed, and South Africa was doing pretty well. The great strides made forwards by the ANC were electrification for half the country that didn't have it before, free education for junior schools, free hospitalization for people really of all ages. All of those things that used to be part of white privilege, where whites enjoyed that. So in education and in health and in housing and in electrification, I think the ANC did very well up until the Zuma years. And then in the Zuma years, we all know just how much the place was plundered, not essentially by Zuma, in my opinion, but it was really plundered by the Guptas, right, who arrived and just left with half the country's economy.
Can you just
I don't think Zuma himself...
Can you just say who the Guptas were, for people who don't know?
Well, the Guptas were an Indian family who arrived here with very little, and they managed to manipulate the state-owned enterprises so that they changed the ways that tenders were done, doubled the amounts, and left with the money. I don't think they left President Zuma very wealthy, but they themselves were very wealthy indeed. And what they did was destroy the state-owned enterprise by putting in sort of cadres that would be subservient to their interests rather than trying to do the best for the country. And to some extent, the whole economy was skewed and was allowed to rot, as it were. So we did well as a country, I think, up until in the first 10 years in terms of the economy.
Let's go to the next slide as well, because it's worth bringing in this figure here, because this is Julius Malema, who's capitalized perhaps on the failings of the ANC and has a much more populist message and possibly more dangerous message as well, Peter.
Yes, I mean, he's like the Donald Trump or the Bolsonaro. He's the populist who says, you know, well, we'll just nationalize everything, all the land, all the mines, all the banks, and he does whatever sounds really good to undereducated people. And so they love him. And he is a former leader of the ANC. He was a youth leader of the ANC, and he fell out over Zuma. And he was quite right about Zuma being both incompetent and easily corruptible. I think the ANC had, if you look at it, the task that they had to do to rebuild the economy after the apartheid years. The apartheid years was extremely good to white people. So the country was very well run for white people. But black people were hardly considered people during the apartheid years. So you know how to change that skewing, right? And the problem with the ANC was it was new to ballot box politics. And it said, well, we're going to change everything and suddenly everything will be fine, right? Both Mandela and Mbeki were far more cautious and said, well, these things will take a lot of time. We'll do it slowly. But Zuma was very happy to say, no, we'll sort everything out. You'll all be fine. Don't worry. And you couldn't do it. I mean, it would take years and years and years for anybody to try to right things. So I think the task that the ANC set itself at the ballot box was the wrong task. They should have been saying, we have nothing to offer you but blood, sweat, and tears as we try and get this country sorted out. Right. You also had people who moved straight into becoming ministers in the ANC who'd never been through the normal channels of starting off at city council level and then moving up to provincial level and learning all of those things. That they were suddenly becoming ministers. And then the last thing that I would say is that we all know power corrupts, but the longer that you're in power, the more corrupt you get. And the ANC has been in power for too long. So a lot of those ministers have kind of been there since the beginning. And in the beginning, people are hugely public-minded, whether they go into city councils or into provincial councils. But after they've been there for 5 or 10 years, they start thinking about themselves a lot more than they do about the public good. That's my experience of politics. And I think that in any country, it's very good to change governments occasionally. And in our country, we've now had the same government for 26 years.
Nozipho, the GEAR stands for Growth, Employment and Redistribution.
That's right. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
That makes sense there, really. As it's basic macroeconomic policy of South Africa.
Yeah.
We've got I go to Nando's for my political analysis of South Africa. Nando's have got some very astute advertising that I think really puts the sort of finger on the pulse of South African politics. And we've got one of those coming up now, and they touch upon the points we've been talking about. So, Isabel, if you could bring up the first of those, and the quality is a bit so-so, but I think you'll get the idea. Oh, Isabel, there's no sound here. Have you got the sound? Can you hear any sound, you lot?
No.
No.
Let's see if we can get the sound here. So go back to that and try that again. While Isabel's trying to figure that one out, the point that the video picks up on is xenophobia. And if you're an outsider to South Africa, you think of the legacy of apartheid, you might think of blacks versus whites. But within South Africa, there's a huge ethnic mix, both internally, but also many people, migrant workers who have come into South Africa from Central Africa, places like the Congo, also from Zambia, from Zimbabwe. And there's a lot of hostility among some black South Africans towards them. They see them as taking their jobs. And that's something that Julius Malema has sort of pinpointed, or some populists have pinpointed. Let's have another go, see if we can play that again and see if that works.
You know what's wrong with South Africa? All you foreigners. You must all go back to where you came from. You Cameroonians, Congolese, Pakistanis, Somalis, Ghanaians, and Kenyans. And of course, you Nigerians. And you Europeans. Let's not forget all you Indians and Chinese. Even you Afrikaners. Back to Swaziland for you Swatis, Lesotho for you Sotos, Tswanas, Vendas, Zulus, everybody.
Real South Africans love diversity.
Right, and then it's Nando's have introduced a new kind of chip. It's very good. But I always think that racism is alive and well within South Africa. If you go to a white neighborhood, you still refer to people who work for you as boys. You know, if a black person who works in your employment is known as a boy, in America, that would just cause outrage. And it works both ways, Nozipho, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean, it does. I think we still socially and economically very apart. I mean, maybe even spiritually, you know. But I think it's going to take a lot longer than 25 years for South Africans to really find a way in which we can create a national identity which we all relate to the same. But yes, I mean, if you go anywhere, you know, Black people will tend to go with our own Black friends. But I don't know about you, Peter, but the mixture is not very. The social integration is still something that we're struggling with, I believe.
Yeah, we do struggle with it, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that people tend to stick with their own groups, whether it's a religious group, whether it's a sporting group. I'm with the cycling people, and whether their color makes no difference. But to some extent in religion, it makes a difference, and socially, it also does make a difference.
Yeah,
I think you're a bit out of...
I've lived in other countries. I've lived in UK, I've lived in America, I've lived in Switzerland. It feels different when you live in those countries, for sure. So I think it will happen, but at this stage, sometimes you have to do things deliberately in order for them to change. They don't just happen by process of osmosis. So I think that deliberate kind of socializing with one another is something that we're still struggling with a little. As for the xenophobia is for me a scapegoat thing. A lot of people have come to South Africa because we have a different constitution. They felt a sense of freedom. It was like going in America as a Black person to look for opportunity. That's what South Africa really has become for many people from other parts of the continent. And I think in the early years when the economy was not doing so badly, there was less of the xenophobia that we've seen in more recent years. The worst, of course, was in 2008, when quite a number of people from outside of South Africa were killed, mainly Black Africans. So people are also talking more about a xenophobia that's really targeted at Black Africans rather than Chinese, for example, because there are lots of Chinese and people from other nations who come to South Africa. And I think it's an expression of people feeling really cheated to a large extent, partly by the ANC, who hasn't delivered on its promise. And so finding the scapegoat, you know, in the foreigner. The foreigner then becomes that bad person who's come and taken my job. And nobody has really done proper research to see how much foreign traders in our townships have contributed to our economy, for example. Political parties don't reach out to them, you know, when voting time comes, those that have been long enough here to have their papers done. There are a lot of also undocumented people who live in this country. And they have to hide themselves from the law, you know, because they don't want to be found out. So there's a lot of work we also have to do. And I think political parties are really not doing enough to address the issue of xenophobia and managing, first of all, our borders, you know, people coming and going. The Home Affairs is terribly incompetent in this regard. So yeah, South Africans basically don't mind really having people from other countries living here, but I think they need to be taken better care of, all of them, you know, and the ANC has let them down. The ANC government, there's too much poverty And so you tend to take it out on the person who's nearest to you. And the
Peter,
foreign
go on, Peter.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I went and worked in Somalia because 800 Somalians have been killed in South Africa, and not a single person has been prosecuted for those killings.
Yeah.
At various spaza shops and everything, they're just not considered people, right? In the same way as black people used to be seen by white people. I think I disagree with you, Nicholas, that whites still talk about garden men as boys. I think that's like 10 years ago. I think that has changed quite a lot. I think obviously there's racism in South Africa. There's racism everywhere. The one thing about South Africa that's a little bit different in the racism is that everybody talks about it all the time. I think they don't talk about it in Britain. They don't talk about it in America. They should. They're certainly talking about it now. But South Africans generally talk about it all the time. And I do think, certainly, I see among whites, you know, the attitudes are changing quite a bit. I also find, for instance, when we do a political tour here, we go around and we see that all the sort of top spots are occupied by white people. And the sort of blue-collar workers are all black, right? And people take note of that and say, wow, it's dreadful. But when I go to a conference on things, whether it's like health or whatever it is, you suddenly see that that's changing, that young black women are starting to dominate those conferences. You go to a conference of 500 people, and there are about 150 young black women. And I think things are changing. And I mean, as Nozipho says, 25 years, not a long time. So I think that it'll take another, you know, whatever, and we'll progressively move forwards on that.
Well, the stats don't speak in your favor. If anything, the situation's got worse. 71% of net wealth is held by 10% of the population. And that's something that's got worse over the previous 5-10 years or so. So and whilst there's an emerging middle class, it's not a very sizable one. So at least in terms of economics, it's not looking very well. Not looking
absolutely.
very good.
I was about to say, I mean, if we're talking about the racism that's social racism, when it comes to I was about to say, our real problem is economics, and our real problem is, in fact, to go back to Mandela, I said to him, what do you think our biggest problems are? And he said, crime, unemployment, and education. So those remain our problems. The inequality of South Africa is just utterly dreadful, and we have to change that. And that's getting worse. And that's one of the real things that one can say against the ANC, is that instead of that having changed quite dramatically, which it should have over 26 years, it has got worse, and the inequality is getting worse. It's getting worse virtually everywhere in the world, except in places like Denmark and Sweden and Switzerland.
So,
but
in a moment, I want to ask you where the opposition is in all of this. Howard Gatiss, who's listening in, was asking that question. Where does the DA stand? But we've got another video to play that'll that touches on this point. Again, it's Nando's analysis of the situation. So let's see if we can pull this one up too. Thanks as well.
I've got the Gauteng Minister of Fisheries here. You can't just be passing.
I'll blow you. I'll blow you, Mama.
In fact, I'll blow all of you, okay? I'll blow you. Down! Everybody get down! Get down, man.
So, what does that mean, Peter? What's that all about?
Well, that means that, everybody's driving with blue light brigades, all the ministers, deputy ministers. I remember Tokyo Sekwali said to me he was pushed off the road once. And I mean, he was the premier of the most important province, which is Gauteng in terms of economics. And he was driving in his little Mazda, And he was pushed off the road, and it was for the deputy MEC of somewhere or other, who had a police brigade and bodyguards. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. And if you go to the DA, one of the good things that they did in the Western Cape was they kind of banned blue light brigades, unless there was a reason for somebody to get somewhere in a hurry. But of course, I mean, nobody would enforce that ban. So that was really about the fact there's too much privilege, in my opinion, for senior politicians, even for junior politicians, who get bodyguards and blue light brigades and everything. If they could get rid of all of that and they could come down to the level of the people, I think South Africa would be governed much better.
So power corrupts. I mean, the ANC has been there for a very long time, Nozipho. But I'll come to you in a second and ask a question. But everybody else, please do ask your questions. Look at the Q&A box there. If you could just type your questions in there, and then we can come to you and open up your microphones, and then you can put your questions to Peter Nozipho. Nozipho, the ANC has been in power for a tremendously long period of time, but there doesn't, at the moment, there's Cyril Ramaphosa, who is seen to be a very competent politician. Is the ANC is still essentially a monolith? What's your assessment of where it's going? Is there hope for change? And do you put any faith in the opposition? What's your assessment of the Democratic Alliance, the opposition party?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, our party politics, I'm now talking about politics with a big P. Our party politics in our country is not very impressive. I think what we see now is actually a dearth of leadership. If you compare the leadership that we have now with Madiba's time, you know, those people had a sort of moral authority. You know, they understood the power that they have, the political power that they had, and they were able to use it at the time in ways that were very defined in many ways. I think now our cabinet ministers, the people who are running the show, besides the point that Peter made, that they've all been in the ANC for far too long themselves. None of them have ever run anything because they came straight out of exile or out of prison into political structures. We certainly don't have a meritocratic kind of government in this country. It was a little bit better during Mbeki's days. I think he had the courage to look for resources, human resources and human capital outside of the ANC. And people like myself ended up being ambassadors, and many others, you know, who had some work experience of managing and running institutions before we actually went into government. But as soon as Zuma took over, many people left, and it was back to what they call cadre deployment, really employing people who were party hacks, who went into our institutions to run them. And what we have now is a huge weakening of the institutions of South Africa, which are also contributing to poor service deliveries to people who really need a stronger government to take themselves out of that kind of poverty. So to be honest with you right now, one wonders if, you know, Cyril Ramaphosa came in, he was Madiba's man. If you recall, he was very much at the forefront when Madiba was released from prison, and Madiba wanted him to be to be his successor, really. But anyway, Cyril went and made himself a lot of money. He's now fine. He's now back in power. You can still sense that Madiba influence in him, but I think the political party that he's in is so fractured that it makes it very difficult for him to really pursue the vision that he may personally have for our country. I'm
just going to chip in there, Peter. What do you think of the DA as a possible as the opposition party? And also, could you talk about Mamani, who quit the party? He was a young black leader who'd been brought into the party, had become leader, and then resigned. So perhaps you can just talk briefly about the DA and their problems.
Wow. Well, their problems are not brief. Their problems are very lengthy. I mean, the major problem that they have is they're perceived as a white party. They're demonized by the ANC wherever they go. The ANC in rural areas where people are more likely to believe things, more susceptible to untruths, as it were. They tend to say, well, if you vote for the DA, you're just voting for apartheid again, for apartheid to come back. But the DA itself also has too many white people at the top. They are the biggest opposition party in South Africa. They remain the biggest opposition party. They make a very big contribution when they're in parliament, or when in fact they run the Western Cape and they run some municipalities, or quite a few municipalities. The problem is they seem to have a ceiling, not a glass ceiling, a white ceiling in terms of becoming the government. A little bit like the Labour Party in Britain. When are they ever going to be able to get a single-minded Labour Party? What they're fighting against as well is they're fighting against apartheid, that they were seen as being the apartheid party, which they're not at all. I mean, it's untrue. And the ANC itself is this party of a bunch of communists with a bunch of capitalists. I mean, in a single party. So you've got all the trade unions, and you've got all the people who are capitalists, and you've got the people who are sort of ultra-left communists in a single party. It's a very odd thing. It would be great if the ANC could split and you could have the two kind of parties that you have in Britain or in America, where it's quite easy to see the different sides.
It's amazing. It does seem like a huge sort of monolith and unchanged, apart from Julius Malema splitting away and creating the Economic Freedom Party.
Yeah.
I'm going to move the conversation on, if you don't mind, because we've got questions coming in, and there's a question which I think is a very relevant one. If we could bring Simon Jackson up, and the background to this one is the power cuts. If you haven't lived in South Africa, or you haven't spent time traveling there, you'll know that there are rolling blackouts from neighborhood to neighborhood regularly, and this is a country which has got enormous coal supplies. And has had a very strong power infrastructure dating back into the 70s and before, but hasn't really been renewed. Simon, your microphone should be open. So do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. By the way, solidarity on middle-aged male haircuts here. I did some work about 10 years ago with Transnet and Eskom, both of which were at the very, very solid public corporate monoliths. Eskom in particular seems to have moved from that to there are the rolling blackouts. I heard a story that the development institutions are going to club together they feel the need to get together and try and sort it out, a collective bailout. And that is, that's something which it takes a lot for them to get together like that. How has that come about, and what's the solution?
Has anyone, we may not be the experts here on this one, but Nozipho, I mean, there's a huge debate about power shortages, but it's very evident that there's been a lack of investment in the infrastructure.
Yes, and the pity is that it happened so quickly. I mean, one of the things when I was in Switzerland as ambassador, one of the things we said to potential investors was, we had the best electricity company in the world. Eskom was really one of the best in the world, and not only did it power us, but all our neighbors as well. And we took it over and literally decimated it, really. And it had partly to do with the corruption that Peter was talking about earlier on, with the Gupta family, that basically their vision was to take over all the state-owned enterprises, because they all fall under that terminology, state-owned enterprises, and turn them into ATMs from when they stole money. So really that's what happened. It was just everybody was using Eskom, Transnet, the others as ways and means from which they could rip off the state, really. And of course, people left, you know, because the place was so badly managed. We lost a lot of the people who knew about generation of electricity and its other facets. And so we were literally left with and the other thing that the ANC government did was to use the state-owned enterprises to deal with unemployment issues. So they just kept employing people into these institutions. So they're all very bloated. The people have got unreasonably high salaries. The unions also control them. So a combination of the politicians, the unions, the Guptas, you know, and just pure unadulterated incompetence is what's led to these institutions being what they are.
Yeah.
And rebuilding them is going to be very difficult, unfortunately.
Just a little tip, Nozipho, if you could sit back when you're talking, because sometimes we lose your head when you're coming forward.
Yes.
Can we take a question from Barbara Clark and then Andy Mendes, if we can bring those two up. It'll take a few seconds to bring those up. So Barbara, you should be able to talk now. If you're just check your microphone is open, Barbara. Can you hear us now? Yeah, there you go. You can go ahead and ask a question, Barbara.
Yes, I can. I'm trying to find my question, but it was basically about what are the sources of information and influence that the mass of people have in terms of their sort of political thinking, and how could these or others break in on this stranglehold that the ANC has over the political dialogue?
Peter, do you want to take that to start with?
Yeah, it's a great question, and if I had the answer, I'd be worth a gold mine, I'm sure. There is a problem in rural areas. People listen to the radio, and they're very religious generally, so they listen to religious broadcasts, and they're not interested in the politics. So and they're not interested in the news, a lot of them. They're interested in daily life, and they're interested in making a living. In the big cities, like all around the world, the newspapers, when I was the editor, I had a staff of 242 reporters. I think the current editor has 22 reporters. To give you some idea of the change in daily newspapers, I mean, it's enormous. There's an independent television station. In fact, I mean, we have like 200 television stations, but there's one independent news television station, which is quite independent, but not as independent as it should be, which is ETV. And then there's a state broadcaster who is it's not bad, and it's getting better under Cyril. It was dreadful under Zuma. There was cadre deployment there as well, and it's hugely bloated, and it costs a fortune. But in the same way as people will criticize the BBC, people will always criticize the SABC. So television is there, and certainly at the upper echelons of society, you've got people have got to the BBC and CNN and everything, even Fox News if you wanted. I don't know how you change it, Barbara. I mean, I really would love to know how one gets the message out there and says, this is what's really going on. And then on top of it, you know, there are people who, politics itself is quite a complex thing to understand. So for rural people, they support the ANC the way that you would support Manchester United or you'd support a club. It's your club. Doesn't matter if they're at the bottom of the league, you still support them, even if they're not doing that well. And I think politics in South Africa at the moment is a little bit like that people tend to support the ANC almost as part of their church.
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great answer. Let's take a question from Andy Mendes, which sort of touches upon what you were saying earlier on also about rural communities. Andy, you go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's partly answered it already, but in the discussion earlier, there was no mention of the church or of any Christian influence, if you like, in the development in South Africa. Now, in Tutu's time, he very much led that. Sue's telling me that Mandela is a good Marxist, probably wouldn't support Christianity. But it'd be interested to know whether the church still has a significant role, and opportunity, and if it does have that opportunity, is it is it actually using it in current politics?
I think the church, I think the church does have quite a bit of influence. I mean, I think that the formal established churches, the South African government, the ANC has made it in their attempt to kind of diversify, you know, really value the notion of diversity. At most of the formal events that they have, you will often have somebody from the Catholic Church, somebody from the Anglican Church, somebody from the Muslim community, somebody from the Jewish community, and they all say their prayers, you know, at the start of any formal event that the ANC is organized. So there is a sense that, you know, the country is multiracial, it's multicultural, it's multi-religious, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you look at what's happening in the sort of less affluent, poorer communities, the evangelical churches are really taking over. There's been an upsurge of these fake priests and evangelical priests who offer people hope for the future, but only if they pray and pay and pay these tithes that they ask them to pay. So there's a tension between the formal established religions and these up-and-coming ones that really seem to be luring the poor into taking them out. There's really sort of opiate of the people kind of approach to religion and spirituality. And recently, the government has set up an institution to look into the behavior of these churches. And some of them really doing quite terrible things. So yes, so religion is being used to manipulate on the one hand, but at the same time, the more established traditional kind of religion is still very strong in this country. People are basically Christians largely. They follow the Christian tradition.
Andy, you traveled in South Africa, didn't you? And you came, you traveled. When were you there?
Ooh, 2-3 years ago with on a private job with Peter.
Yeah. And it's quite. Sorry, Nozipho, do you saying?
No, I was going to ask Peter. I don't know what his observations have been on this.
No, I think you've covered it pretty well.
I think it's certainly very visible, isn't it? I mean, all the countries we go to, I think South Africa is among the places where you see people going to church far more openly than you know, really, and I think including many developing nations as well. You on Sundays and on other days, you see people, you know, very smart, making a real effort, and you know, sizable numbers as well. So it's something that's really struck me. We're going to sort of wrap up quite soon, but I'm very keen for people to either ask more questions or join in the debate. And we've got Andy and Barbara with us now, and Simon, of course. But please do, if you've got, raise a hand or put a question in the question box, or stay online in a bit for our discussion. I do want to. I've got another question coming in here. Yeah, okay, Nigel Harley has raised his hand. So see if we can get Nigel as well online, and then we can take a question from Nigel. I think, Peter, one of the things that strikes me about South Africa is that there are numerous problems, huge economic problems. There seems to be, and particularly under Zuma, a significant political uncertainty. And then more recently, there's COVID-19 and the enormous impact that could have on the country with a very vulnerable and poor population. Yet at the same time, somehow it all manages to stay together. You haven't had a situation develop like Zimbabwe. You haven't seen a decline that many other countries have gone into. And so it does seem quite resilient. And sometimes I don't understand why it's so resilient.
Well, it has a lot of natural resources. You know, Jan Smuts, I think it was, who said, the problem with South Africa is that the best that could happen never happens. But the good thing about South Africa is that the worst that could happen also never happens. We're always somewhere in between. And I think from Jan Smuts' day, we're still somewhere around there. We have huge natural resources. We have amazing beauty. I mean, our game reserves are fantastic. So in terms of what we can do, we're able to manufacture. We have the metals and the minerals in the ground. We have the wildlife. We have the sea, we have sort of all the good things that you could put together in a country in order to make it profitable, we have. And we just continue to squander it, unfortunately. I think one of the current problems is because of the unemployment. I think generally in developed countries, people go into politics because they wish to make a difference, or they want to contribute to society. Here it's become a way to earn money. It's a job. So a lot of the people who become city councillors can do nothing else. If they're not a city councillor, they're unemployed and they have very few skills. And that goes all the way through to provincial and to national government. People become MPs in order to earn the salary. I don't think that happens in developed countries generally. The salary is seen as too low. Here it's seen as a very nice job to have. And I hope that somehow we're able to get rid of that. And that's where the kind of people like Julius Malema make a big difference, because they're able to say, why are these guys living at such a high level when they should be living with the people and representing the people?
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a great summary. Nigel, have you got a question, or have you got a sort of comment to make? If you've got a comment, I might save it for a moment later, but if you've got a question to put to our panelists, do you want to go ahead and ask it now? Nigel, your microphone should be open. Do you want to check your microphone? Just see if you're on mute, because you may be on mute. Nozipho, is that? Would you agree with Peter there on that summary of South Africa's resilience despite against all the odds?
Yes, I think the resilience is also sort of built on just hard experience of living in a pretty tough environment. People's coping skills really get quite a stretch, and I think they're able to deal with all kinds of hardships, you know. So and I think South Africans are also generally quite optimistic people, you know. We don't give up when things are really bad. So they keep hoping for a better time in the future. I think the young people are beginning to realize that whilst, you know, political freedom has been very great in many ways, just the freedom to move around, the freedom to speak your mind, the freedom to do all the things that we couldn't do pre-apartheid, they are now also really realizing that economic freedom is what they need as well. And so certainly in the circles that I move in, there are lots of young, very robust entrepreneurs who are also becoming social entrepreneurs. In other words, you know, for them, it's not about profit only, it's about purpose. And so it's very encouraging to see that amongst the younger generation, going into businesses, creating their own startups, and understanding that the state is not going to give them jobs because there just aren't enough. And with the fourth industrial revolution, the way it's moving, you know, more people are going to lose formal jobs from companies and so on. There's this desire to start their own IT companies, and all sorts of things are happening that are really giving them a lot of hope. But they realize they have to create their own future and not depend on political parties to change that for them.
Yeah.
So that's very, very, very encouraging.
Nigel, if you've got a question there, or if it's a comment, we'll save it for later.
Yeah, I've got a question really, and it's about education. I mean, along with everything else, all the state institutions that suffered at the time of Zuma's presidency, one heard these horrendous stories about schools lacking the means, about teachers leaving in droves, and you know, there was this tremendous contrast between the private educational institutions and the state. I'm wondering really what sort of priority Ramaphosa is giving to education, because it is obviously for the future of the country.
Now, Nigel, we're having a few problems with your microphone, so just maybe mute it. Can you just say the last bit of it, because I missed out a bit of that.
Well, the last bit of it really was what priority the Ramaphosa government is giving to education, as it is such a critical area.
Nozipho.
Well, I think, you know, education is probably one of the most financed departments in this country. Of all the departments in South Africa, education gets the biggest slice of the cake. The quality of our education is what we are all fighting for. It's poor. People are undereducated or not educated at all, even though they do go to school. I'm on the board of a small little NGO where we do remedial teaching for kids in Alexander Township who literally can't read at the end of their primary school. And therefore their chances are finished, for going into high school and eventually into any other form of higher education. So it shouldn't be the case, but the fact is that their teachers are not properly trained, so the teachers can't teach them, and therefore they're not learning. The state of some of our schools are absolutely appalling. And so whilst there's been a lot of money put into the institution of education, one hasn't seen the impact of that in the society. Free education now at university for people who earn less than a certain amount of money. So we have our higher education. The state education is relatively free. People who do well are those who go to private schools and whose parents can afford to take them to private schools. But those who have got access are getting a very poor quality of education and lots of dropouts. I see also from the university, the Nelson Mandela University, where I spend a lot of time, a whole lot of them will come in at the beginning of the year, but by the middle of the year, we're having almost 40% of them drop out. So yeah, we have huge problems. And again, we've had the same minister. I don't know, our current minister has been there for almost 15 years now as a Minister of Education. We need a change. And really, she hasn't done such a great job of it.
And Nozipho, why did they drop out? That's a really interesting point there.
Well, partly because they are undereducated and they can't cope with the curriculum. So they're struggling, and the university has to do quite a lot of remedial work with them. Just writing, reading because they understand what they're reading, or they haven't really learned some of the basic prerequisites for doing a higher education, for doing a university degree.
And I think you must accept, Nozipho, I think people must understand that most people in South Africa going to university are doing their degrees in their second language, not in their home language.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Britain or America, where the universities are teaching in their home language. Here, people are being taught in a foreign language, essentially English.
But even within their own language, I guess, Nozipho, we've been to schools, also been to hospitals as well. It's very rudimentary, and often we've been to schools and the teachers aren't there, or they turn up drunk. There can be some.
Yeah, the teachers. If you compare, Peter, to a place like Kenya, or even Ghana or Nigeria, where they also use English as a medium of instruction. I think we've all accepted that English is always going to be the medium of instruction. So people do mother tongue education when they're in primary school, but certainly it's not a medium for instruction. So, and that's not going to change in the next, I don't know how many years, because our own languages have not really been developed to make them appropriate for higher education purposes. So the challenge, therefore, is how do you get the teachers to teach them the language, the English language, so that they can do degrees and they can learn through it, like they do in other parts of the continent. Zimbabweans who work largely in our restaurants, they're far more articulate and fluent in English than a lot of South Africans are, and they've had exactly the same kind of experience as we have.
I'm really struck when traveling in South Africa. It's the migrants who are working in the restaurants, who are working in retail, and you talk about the complaints about foreigners taking all the jobs. But it does seem all the foreigners have got the best education.
They have a better education, certainly, than we are. Formal education, definitely.
Yeah. To answer Nigel's question, yes, Cyril has put a lot of money towards it. The real problem, one of the problems is the infrastructure. The other one is that the trade union is a dreadful trade union. It protects all the teachers. It sort of almost blocks the teachers from getting more education, and it and it supports teachers who don't come to work or arrive drunk, and the trade union interferes in appointing principals and teachers and takes money, bribes as it were, in order to appoint its people as the principal instead of this being done by the government. It's really it's a bad show at the moment. And Nigel, allocating money to it is not the way that it's going to be solved. There's sufficient money.
Oh, there's enough money. Money is not the problem, definitely.
I think that's a fascinating point to end on, and it comes back to, I think, you raised at the very beginning the question of Mandela was a great guy at getting people to work and spend money, and I'm not blaming him for this, but the core question of governance was something that didn't interest him so much, and how things are executed, and maybe that's a broader lesson for South Africa as a whole. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say. I want to say thank you very much indeed to Peter Sullivan and to Nozipho January-Bardill for their contributions. It's been a really, really interesting hour. Thank you very much for your time. Our next conversation, our next briefing is on North Korea's economy, and it's with Professor Rudiger Frank. That's this coming Thursday at 12 p.m. UK time. Rudiger Frank is a great speaker, and he's probably one of the world's leading experts on North Korea, and it's well worth tuning in for that one.